Sarah was a college student who loved to explore old, abandoned buildings. She had heard rumors of a haunted asylum on the outskirts of town, and she couldn't resist the urge to check it out. Sarah arrived at the asylum late at night, and with only a flashlight and a sense of adventure, she crept through the dark hallways, feeling her heart racing with excitement and fear. As she explored the building, Sarah heard strange noises echoing through the halls. She tried to ignore them, telling herself that they were just the sounds of an old building settling. But the noises grew louder and more persistent. Soon, Sarah was convinced that she wasn't alone in the asylum. She turned a corner and saw something that made her blood run cold. A ghostly figure was standing at the end of the hallway, staring right at her. Sarah froze, too scared to move. The figure started to move towards her, its eyes fixed on her like it was searching for something. Sarah tried to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She stumbled and fell, scraping her knee on the rough concrete floor. The figure was getting closer and closer, and Sarah knew that she was out of options. She closed her eyes and braced for impact, waiting for the ghost to reach her. But when she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. Sarah was alone in the hallway, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. She slowly got to her feet and started to make her way back towards the exit. She felt like she was being watched the entire time, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. When she finally made it outside, she breathed a sigh of relief. But as she looked back at the asylum, she saw the ghostly figure standing in one of the windows, watching her. Sarah never returned to the haunted asylum again, but she could never forget the feeling of being watched by something she couldn't see. Mark was a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. He didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings, and he scoffed at people who claimed to have seen apparitions or heard strange noises in the night. But that was before he found himself alone in a cemetery at midnight. Mark had been out late with friends, and he had to walk through the cemetery to get home. He told himself that it was just a shortcut, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But as he walked through the rows of gravestones, Mark started to feel like he wasn't alone. He heard rustling in the bushes, and he felt like he was being watched. He quickened his pace, hoping to get out of the cemetery as soon as possible. But as he turned a corner, he saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. A figure was standing in front of him, its eyes fixed on him like it was studying him. Mark tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but stare at the figure. As the figure got closer, Mark could see that it was a woman in a white dress. She had long, flowing hair, and her eyes were cold and lifeless. Mark tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped in his own body, unable to escape the ghostly figure that was coming towards him. Just as the figure was about to reach him, Mark woke up in his own bed. It had all been a dream, he told himself. But when he got up to use the bathroom, he noticed something strange. There were muddy footprints on his bedroom floor, leading from the window to his bed. Mark never walked through that cemetery alone at night again, and he could never explain how the footprints got there. He started to believe that there was something out there, something beyond his understanding, something that could terrify even the bravest skeptic. Jenny was always fascinated by the abandoned house at the end of her street. It had been vacant for years, and the neighbors all whispered about the strange happenings that took place inside. One night, Jenny decided to explore the house for herself. She snuck in through the back door, a flashlight in hand. The inside of the house was even more eerie than she had imagined. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and there were cobwebs hanging from every corner. As she made her way through the house, she noticed a faint sound in the distance. It sounded like someone was crying. Jenny followed the sound to a dark corner of the house. where she found an old chest sitting in the shadows. The crying was coming from inside the chest. Jenny hesitated, unsure if she should open the chest. But her curiosity got the better of her, and she slowly lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a small, dirty doll with tears painted on its face. As soon as she touched the doll, the crying stopped. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, and the temperature in the room dropped drastically. Jenny tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. As she stood there, trapped in the room with the doll, she heard a voice whisper in her ear, "I've been waiting for you." Jenny turned around, but no one was there. The voice spoke again, this time louder and more menacing. "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly, the door opened, and Jenny ran out of the house as fast as she could. She never looked back. From that day on, Jenny never went near the abandoned house again. But every once in a while, she could still hear the faint sound of a crying doll in the distance, and she knew that she had stumbled upon something beyond her understanding. Alice woke up one day with a strange feeling in her chest. She felt like something wasn't quite right, like she was disconnected from her own body. As the day went on, Alice began to notice more strange things. She couldn't remember certain events from her past, and when she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize the person staring back at her. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that she wasn't real. She felt like she was just a character in a story, a figment of someone else's imagination. Alice tried to brush off these feelings, but they only grew stronger as time went on. She would have moments where she would feel like she was fading away, like she wasn't really there. One day, Alice decided to confront the person she believed was responsible for her existence. She searched high and low, but she couldn't find anyone who would admit to creating her. Desperate for answers, Alice began to spiral out of control. She stopped eating and sleeping, convinced that if she did, she would disappear completely. As she lay in bed one night, feeling like she was about to disappear into nothingness, Alice heard a voice in her head. It was a voice she didn't recognize, but it spoke with such authority that she couldn't ignore it. "You are not real," the voice said. "You are nothing but a character in someone else's story. And like all characters, your time is up." With those words, Alice vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a faint memory in the mind of a creator. John had hit rock bottom. His life had spiraled out of control, and he was left with nothing but regret and guilt. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and he knew he could never make things right. One night, as he lay in bed, consumed by his thoughts, John began to pray. He prayed to God for forgiveness, for a second chance to make things right. He begged for a sign that he was not alone, that there was still hope for him. But his prayers were met with silence. And then, something else. John started to hear strange noises in his house at night. Scratching at his door, whispering in his ear, and footsteps that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He began to have horrific nightmares, where he was tormented by demons and forced to confront his worst fears. The more John prayed, the worse it got. He felt as if he was being punished, as if his past sins were being brought to the forefront and amplified. He felt like he was drowning in his own darkness, and there was no one there to save him. Desperate, John sought out the help of a priest. But even the holy man was unable to rid him of the demons that haunted him. In fact, it only seemed to make things worse. John started to see visions of the priest, twisted and contorted, with black eyes and a twisted grin. He would wake up screaming, convinced that he was being attacked by supernatural forces. As the days went by, John's grip on reality began to slip. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped leaving his house. He became a recluse, trapped in his own personal hell. And then, one night, John had a revelation. The demons weren't real. They were just a manifestation of his own guilt and self-loathing. They were a reflection of the darkness within him that he had been trying so desperately to escape. With this realization, John was finally able to confront his past and find a way to move forward. He started attending therapy, working through his issues, and slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his life. But the nightmares never really went away, and John was always haunted by the memory of the demons that he had conjured up in his own mind. He knew that he would never truly be free from his own darkness, but he was finally able to come to terms with it and live a more peaceful life. Amy had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would never go to bed without a nightlight, and even as an adult, she would sometimes leave a hallway light on when she went to sleep. One night, Amy woke up in the middle of the night to find that the power had gone out. She fumbled for her phone to use as a flashlight, but it was dead. She was alone in the darkness. At first, Amy tried to convince herself that everything was okay. She reminded herself that she was an adult now and there was nothing to be afraid of. But as time went on, she began to feel more and more uneasy. Then she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the room. Amy's heart raced as she tried to identify the source of the noise. Was it a mouse? A raccoon? Something more sinister? The scratching grew louder and more frantic, and Amy felt a wave of terror wash over her. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't find a voice. Finally, the power came back on, and Amy was able to turn on the lights. She searched the room but found nothing out of place, no sign of any animal or intruder. But as she lay back down to go to sleep, Amy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. And as she drifted off into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't help but wonder if the darkness had unleashed something terrifying within her own mind. There was an old hotel that sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It had been abandoned for years, and many claimed that it was haunted by the ghosts of its former guests. One night, a group of friends decided to explore the old hotel for a thrill. They climbed through a broken window and made their way down the dimly lit hallways, using only their flashlights to guide them. As they explored the hotel, strange things began to happen. Doors that they had closed would suddenly swing open, and they heard footsteps coming from the empty rooms. They tried to ignore it, chalking it up to their imaginations, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As they turned a corner, they saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman in a white gown, with long dark hair and a pale complexion. She started to walk towards them, and they ran in the opposite direction. But no matter where they went, the woman was always there, always chasing them. They found themselves lost in the maze-like hotel, with no way out. They could hear the woman's laughter echoing through the halls, and they knew they were in deep trouble. As they stumbled through the darkness, they saw a glimmer of light in the distance. They ran towards it, hoping it was an exit, but when they got closer, they realized it was a room filled with mirrors. The woman was right behind them, her eyes gleaming with malice. They had nowhere left to run. They were trapped in the haunted hotel with the ghosts of its former guests, who would never let them leave. And so, they were never seen or heard from again. There was an old, isolated house on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for years. It was said that the family had lived there, but they had all disappeared under mysterious circumstances. One night, a group of friends decided to explore the old house to see if they could uncover the truth behind its dark past. As they entered the house, they immediately felt a chill in the air, and they could hear strange noises coming from the shadows. As they explored the house, they found old family photos and newspapers with headlines about a tragic family massacre that had occurred years ago. Suddenly, they heard footsteps coming from upstairs, and they cautiously made their way up the stairs. As they entered one of the bedrooms, they saw a figure lying in the bed. It was the ghostly apparition of a woman with long, flowing hair and a pale complexion. She slowly turned to face them, and they could see the fear and sadness in her eyes. Suddenly, they heard a sound of footsteps behind them. They turned to see a figure in a black cloak, carrying a large, bloody knife. It was the ghost of the family's killer, who had never been caught. The group tried to run, but the doors and windows had mysteriously locked from the outside. They were trapped in the haunted house with the ghosts of its former inhabitants, who would never let them leave. And so, they were lost forever in the darkness of the abandoned house, their fate sealed by the tragic events that had occurred there so many years ago. It was a dark and stormy night, and Emily was walking home from her friend's house. As she walked down the deserted street, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned around, but there was no one there. She quickened her pace, and the feeling of being followed grew stronger. She turned around again, and this time, she saw a shadowy figure in the distance. Emily started to run, but the figure was getting closer and closer. She could hear its heavy footsteps behind her, and she knew she had to act fast. She ducked into a nearby alleyway, hoping to lose the figure in the darkness. As she huddled in the shadows, she heard the figure approach. She could hear its ragged breathing and the sound of its footsteps on the pavement. Emily held her breath, hoping that it wouldn't find her. Suddenly, she heard a voice whisper in her ear. "I've been waiting for you," the voice hissed. Emily screamed and ran out of the alleyway as fast as she could. She didn't stop running until she got to her house. She locked the door and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the area but found no trace of the figure that had been following her. But Emily knew what she had seen and heard. She knew that she had been followed by something not of this world, something that wanted to do her harm. And from that day on, she never walked home alone at night again, for fear that she would encounter that terrifying figure once more. There was a small town in the middle of nowhere that was known for its strange happenings. People reported seeing strange figures lurking in the shadows and hearing eerie noises coming from the surrounding woods. Despite these odd occurrences, the townspeople went about their business as usual, thinking nothing of the strange happenings. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the woods outside of town. They had heard rumors of a haunted house deep in the woods and wanted to see it for themselves. As they made their way deeper into the woods, the air grew colder and the trees grew denser. As they approached the house, they noticed that it was old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows and overgrown vines. They hesitated for a moment, but their curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate. As soon as they stepped inside, they knew they had made a mistake. The air was thick with a foul smell, and they could feel something watching them from the shadows. Suddenly, one of the teenagers screamed as something grabbed her from behind and dragged her into the darkness. The rest of the group tried to run, but they found themselves trapped. The doors and windows had all been boarded up, and there was no escape. They huddled together in fear, waiting for whatever had taken their friend to come back for them. Hours passed, and they could hear strange noises coming from the darkness. They tried to ignore them, but their fear only grew stronger. Eventually, they heard footsteps approaching, and they braced themselves for the worst. But when the figure emerged from the darkness, they were shocked to see that it was not a monster or ghost, but a human. He was old and haggard, with a wild look in his eyes. He explained to them that he had been living in the house for years, hiding from the outside world. The teenagers were terrified, but the old man seemed harmless enough. and they were relieved to be rescued from the darkness. As they made their way back to town, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them from the shadows. They knew they would never forget their harrowing experience in the haunted house.